بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So inshallah in today's class we are going to read verses 9, 10 and 11, and what we will discuss, some of the main things that we will discuss is, first we will discuss what taklif is, what moral obligation is. Now of course we've talked about taklif before in our fiqh class, but of course everything that we're going to talk about in Islam and Islamic sciences is predicated on taklif. So it's one of those things that it doesn't hurt for us to do it again. However, in today's discussion on taklif, we will talk about the people who receive the message and the people who don't receive the message and what exactly is meant by that. And we will introduce a concept of the people of a time period, Ahlul Fatra, with the fatha on the fa, Ahlul Fatra, the people of a time period, which is a technical term. It's a mustalah that is found in the language of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So I need to explain that to you. Related to that, then we will talk about the ruling of the parents of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, because the universal belief in Sunni Islam is that they are saved. So we will talk about why that is the case and what that means. In the process of talking about that, we will also talk about some of the positions of the Mu'tazilites and some of the positions of the Maturidiyya as it relates to things that are obligatory to know. How do we know the things that are obligatory to know? Are they taught to us simply by religion, or are they taught to us through reason, which are the Ash'ari and the Maturidi position, and the Ash'ari and the Mu'tazilite position, and the Maturidiyya have kind of a middle path when it comes to this issue. So we will talk about that. Then the verses 10 and 11 will introduce the three rational rulings. Something is either rationally obligatory, rationally possible, or rationally impossible. Those are the keys to understanding all of Sunni theology. And if a theology book doesn't begin with that, it's either a very introductory book or it's not a Sunni theology book. And this is the class, or this is the lecture, inshallah, in which we will introduce those concepts, so it will become very clear why we talk about the things we talk about and how we talk about them. And I'll see you back in the first clip to begin this discussion, inshallah. So we will begin by reading the Arabic text. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. Verse 9. فكل من كلف شرعا وجب عليه أن يعرف ما قد وجب لله والجائز والممتنع ومثل ذا لرسله فاستمع إذ كل من قلد في التوحيد إيمانها لم يخلو من ترديد. So he says rahimahullah, and for every accountable person, or every morally responsible person, which is how I translate taklif, for every morally responsible person, it is a legal obligation for him to know what is necessary. For Allah, the permissible and the impossible. So those are the three categories. And the like thereof of His messengers, alayhim salam. So listen carefully. Since anyone who follows other in the belief in oneness, his faith is not safe from doubt. So he ends by talking about taqleed, or following other people in matters of aqidah. Okay, let me just get the hashiyah going here in the Arabic, so I have both in front of me. Okay. So he begins by talking about taklif, moral responsibility. Now we know that the Sharia is here to address those who are morally responsible, the mukallaf. Who is the mukallaf? The conditions for the mukallaf is it's somebody who has become of age, bulugh, maturity. It is somebody who has an aql, who has their full mental capacity. It is somebody who has received the da'wah, which is what we'll talk about the most now, and somebody who has all of their senses intact. So, the way that the ulama discuss definitions is when they list things like that, they say who is excluded from these groups. So let's go back. The baligh, the person who is from the person who has reached an age of puberty, which means the non-baligh is not mukallaf. So before a boy or girl reaches the age of puberty, they're not morally responsible. So it doesn't matter what they do. Let's say you have a 2-year-old infant that just, I don't know, learned how to walk. You're visiting a friend's house and they take, I don't have anything next to me, but they take a glass pitcher and then they throw it on the ground and they break it. They're not responsible for that because they haven't reached the age of taklif. Al-aql, people who have their intellect. So people who don't have their intellect, either somebody who is sleeping or somebody who is insane temporarily or permanently, because the Sharia distinguishes between the two, somebody who's sick, etc., somebody who's intoxicated. These people take you out of your senses. So in the moment that you're out of your senses, you don't have taklif. The only notable exception here, of course, as you know from fiqh, that the person who is intoxicated is punished for their intoxication, not because of the taklif, but because taghlidan, because to emphasize the haramness of the consumption of alcohol, which is a separate issue. Bulugh al-da'wah, somebody who has received the message, which means that somebody who has not received the message is not morally responsible. I'll come back to that because that's where the bulk of the discussion is. And then salamatul hawas, the person who has all their senses intact. So somebody like Helen Keller, who was deaf and blind, that person does not have taklif, even though they are rewarded if they choose to believe and they find their way to belief and they practice, they'll be rewarded for that. But because all of those senses are not intact, there is too much of the created world that we as human beings were intended to interact with that you can't interact with, so therefore there is no taklif on that person. Okay, before we talk about more of that, let me delve a little bit into the person who receives the message. What does that mean? What it means to receive the message is that somebody has received the message of Islam in an attractive way, بطريقة ملفتة للنظر, in an attractive way, has understood that message and then chosen to reject that message. That is the kafir. That is the disbeliever. If somebody has not received the message of Islam in its entirety, has not received the message of Islam in its entirety in an attractive way, then, which entails that they understand the message of Islam in its basic components, that person is not mukallaf. So in Sunni Islam, we have a category called Ahlul Fatra, the people of the time period, meaning the people of the time period after the advent of Isa alayhi salam, before the advent of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, more than 500-600 years. Those people are what we refer to Ahlul Fatra, because we believe also that all of the Anbiya were sent only to their specific people, whereas Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, one of his unique qualities is he was sent to all of mankind. So therefore, if you're some guy in North America in the 2nd century of the Christian calendar, you have no taklif because you had not received the message. There's no messenger that came at that point, because we also believe there was no messenger between Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam and Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In addition to that, all of the messengers were local, not universal. So Imam al-Ghazali reminds us this category of Ahlul Fatra also exists today from the point of view that somebody who has not received the entire message of Islam or has not received the entire message of Islam in an attractive way. So people that don't know anything about Islam or only know negative things about Islam, what they see on TV from violence and extremism, etc., they have not received Islam for them to reject it. And that's very important that you understand, because sometimes Muslims are a little sloppy and they say, oh, there are believers and kuffar. No, because the kafir is an active thing. It means that you have received the message, understood the message, and then rejected. Kafara is to cover the truth. So you have received the truth and then you reject it and cover it. But if you haven't received the truth, or you received part of it, or you grew up far away from the ulama or far away from the Muslims, or you only know negative things, all of that confusion, that means those people take the ruling of Ahlul Fatra, the people of the time period. This is a quintessential belief, cornerstone belief of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Allah Ta'ala clearly says in the Quran, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذَّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We do not punish a people unless we have sent them a message. This is in Surah Al-Isra verses 15. Okay, so when we said that one of the conditions of taklif is bulugh al-da'wah, receiving the message, that means that if you've not received the message in its entirety, or if you've received the message partially, or if you've received the message mushawwah, that it is adulterated, then that means you are not a person of taklif. And then those people, the people of Ahlul Fatra, are saved despite what they might have done on this earth, even if they worship the idols, or even if they had false beliefs, or even if they had no belief whatsoever. Why? وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذَّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. Allah will not punish a people unless and until they have received the message. So that's a very important thing for us to re-emphasize, and I'm doing a little bit more of the emphasis because for some reason Muslims have lost a lot of that. Now, related to this is the parents of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The universal consensus belief that we have in Islam is that the parents of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam are saved for several reasons. Number one, they can take the position of Ahlul Fatra, but that's maybe a lower position. The higher position is that they were all pure people, because Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَتَقَلُّبَكَ فِي السَّاجِدِينَ, and this is in Shu'ara verses 219, وَتَقَلُّبَكَ فِي السَّاجِدِينَ, we have caused your genetic matter to transfer from one sajid, from one prostrating pious person to another pious prostrating person. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said of himself, وَلِدْتُ مِن نِكَاحٍ وَلَمْ أُلِدْ مِن سِفَاحٍ, I was born from marriage, a lineal descent of marriage, and not from sifah, and not from illicit relations. So none of the Jahili belief, we believe in our Aqidah as Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, touched any of the ancestors of Sayyidina Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, from the time of Adam alayhi salam to the time of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Now so that's another reason. And then the third reason is that there are the Sahih Hadith in which Allah Ta'ala caused, or the Prophet ﷺ asked Allah Ta'ala to resurrect his parents, and he did so. They believed in him, and then they passed again. So for one of these three reasons, or for those three reasons concurrently, our belief is that the parents of the Prophet ﷺ are saved and pure in their belief. Now, Imam al-Suyuti, amongst the people in our camp, he has at least one or two books or treatises about this. I think you can find them in Al-Hawi, Fil Fatawi of Imam al-Suyuti. But it's an important thing for us to believe because it further emphasizes the special traits, the khasa'is of Sayyidina Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. However, this does produce a problem when it comes to Ibrahim alayhi salam and his father, which we'll talk about in the next clip. So we ended by talking about the parents of the Prophet ﷺ as being saved, and we talked about the three reasons why they would be saved. Either they are from Ahlul Fatra, or we follow the verse وَتَقَلُّبُكَ فِي السَّاجِدِينَ, that the genetic matter of the Prophet ﷺ was passed from one pious monotheist from another, from the time of Adam until his birth from his two parents, Sayyidina Abdullah, Sayyidina Amin alayhim as-salam. That's the second reason. And the third reason is we have the traditions in which the Prophet ﷺ asked Allah Ta'ala to have his parents be resurrected. They believed in him, and then they were buried again. And nothing is difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one of the three, or all of the three reasons, we would say that the parents of the Prophet ﷺ, and indeed all of his ancestors, are saved, and they were monotheists. However, this presents a problem with Ibrahim alayhi salam, because Ibrahim, obviously the father of Ismail, the Prophet ﷺ is a lineal descendant of Ismail alayhi salam. The Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, he has this discourse with his quote-unquote father, with قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ لَأَبِيهِ. Abraham says to his father, why are you worshipping these idols? So the way that we reconcile this problem, that the muhaqqiqun, those who analyze this issue, and Imam al-Bayjuri offers the same thing in his Hashiyah here, he says that this was Abraham's uncle, not Abraham's biological father, and he referred to him with a term of endearment by calling him his father. And that is an acceptable tafsir of the verse, and it then reconciles with the broader point of Aqidah that none of the Prophet's ﷺ's ancestors were polytheists. So that's an important thing for us to remember. Okay, he says in the verse, and for every accountable person or legally, morally responsible person, we've talked about that, it's a legal obligation. So it's a fard ayn, we've talked about that, for him to know what is necessary. For him to know what is necessary about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so on and so forth. We'll get to the other verses. Okay. When we talk about, when we talk about what we need to know from a theological point of view, we will talk about our intellect and what the intellect can and can't know. In the Ash'ari school, we say that which is good and that which is bad, as it relates to reward and punishment in the hereafter, is only known through revelation, through wahi. I can know rationally that if I go out and, la qaddar Allah, I kill an innocent person, that's a bad thing, it's a grotesque thing. But for me to capture that it is a bad thing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that opens me to punishment Yawm al-Qiyamah, the Ash'aris, we will say that's really only known through revelation. The Mu'tazilites, who are, as I call them, our punching bag, right? We always beat on them. They say the opposite. They say it's from the aql. It is known rationally. And then the Maturidiyya, rahimahumullah, they have a middle path in which they say, were it not for the presence of the Sharia, eventually the intellect would be able to know it. When we talk about Sunni Islam, we mean the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya. So we can accept the Maturidi, even though the Ash'ari is the dominant madhab, and that's sort of the perspective that we teach in this class. We can accept the Maturidiyya understanding, but we do not accept the Mu'tazilite standing, because their point is that they say that al-hasanul qabih, that which is good and bad, as it relates, that's an important condition, as it relates to what will happen in the hereafter, is known rationally. The difficulty with that is, well, how do you know if there's no revelation? Because there are different things in the different shari'ahs of the past that were haram and halal that are not for us. Even Isa alayhi salam, وَأُحَلِّلُ لَكُمْ بَعْدَ الَّذِي حُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. I've come here to make permissible some of the things that were made haram for you in the past by the way of dietary restrictions and things like that. So the real answer is that you have to have the revelation component. There are some things, like the example I gave of killing an innocent person, all rational people, whether they're Muslim or not, or whether they believe in God or not, they will say that's a bad thing. So and that's what the Maturidiyya are saying. Well, obviously there's a rational component, but how will you be able to deduce that there is a specific reward? This is from the major sins, this is from the minor sins. The whole scheme of the major sins and the minor sins, all that's going to come only from revelation. Right? So that is the Sunni position, or the Ash'ari position, bil asah. Okay. Now, when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are three types of sifat, or three types of traits that belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One type of trait are the traits that can only be determined through rational proofs, such as God's presence, God's eternality, that He has no beginning and He has no end, and His qayyumiyyah, that He is established and is with Himself. In other words, He is not in need of something to be. He doesn't need to rest or to eat or to drink. He doesn't need like a battery, astaghfirullah al-azim. Why are these traits that can only be determined by rational proofs? Because if we said that these are traits that need to be determined by revealed truths, revelation is contingent on a prophet coming with a miracle and the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are things that are more basic than that, like the existence of God Himself. That in and of itself, we argue as Sunni Muslims, that the rational proof establishes that. Because were it not a rational proof and it was contingent on revelation, then it would mean that that proof, that belief would fluctuate throughout time. It would depend if there was revelation or not. In this case, basically what we're saying is it's so obvious that it doesn't even need revelation to establish those proofs, those traits. And then there are other traits that are the opposite, that are only established through the sam'iyat, through our revelation. Like Allah Ta'ala being a Sami' al-Basir, the speech of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. We know those things because they come to us from the text of the Quran and the Sahih Mutawatir Hadith. And then there are those traits in which there's a difference of opinion, such as Allah Ta'ala being one. Allah Ta'ala being one, the monotheistic belief, is that something that is contingent on rational belief? That's the dominant position. Or is it something that is considered contingent on revelation, the minority position? فَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. That comes from the verse, know that there is only one God, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so that's when the next many lectures we'll be talking about the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His traits and attributes. Now we know that there is a difference of opinion, or there are different categories, what's contingent on a rational proof, what's contingent on revelation, and that one issue of monotheism in which there's a difference of opinion. Okay. Now let us begin by talking about the next sort of topic, and final topic, which is the rational proofs. And as I said, this is something that is very essential for you to know, because it is the hallmark of how Sunni Aqidah or Sunni Kalam is discussed. That something, when we come to talk about theology, we will say, as it relates to God and the prophets, plural, alayhim as-salam, there are three rational categories. Either something is rationally necessary, or something is rationally possible, or something is rationally impossible. So something that's rationally impossible is that, this can't be dark, I think this is purple, it can't be purple and white at the same time. Or this can't be a rectangle and a circle at the same time. If I told you that I have an object on my desk that's a circle and a square at the same time, automatically you'll say that's impossible. You being able to say it's impossible means that it's a rational impossibility, meaning that your intellect, your reason is not able to have tasweer, cannot have an image of that, and therefore tasdeeq cannot attribute a belief to that. You might, close your eyes and be like, oh yeah, maybe it morphs like this and like that. Maybe you can have a tasawwur of it. Maybe there can be a tasweer. Maybe you can kind of have an image of it. I mean, it's not a real image, but there's no tasdeeq. You can't have belief in that because it's an impossibility. So the key to understanding how we approach our belief in God and the prophets, alayhim as-salam, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala jalla wa ala, is understanding these three things. And that's why when we get into the next clip, I want to just spend just a little bit more time talking about them and giving you some examples so that we are on the same page. So we ended by introducing this concept in the last clip of the rational categories. Something is either rationally obligatory, rationally possible, rationally impossible, as it relates to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to the Anbiya alayhim as-salam. When we talk about that, one of the things that we learn is that the aql, the intellect, is the tool of perception. But that which perceives is the nafs. So in our belief as human beings, we are a body, a soul, and a self. Al-jasad is the body, the soul is a ruh, and the self is a nafs. The body is the physical body, it's what you see. The ruh, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحِ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the soul. The Jews came to ask Rasulullah ﷺ about the soul, and he said the soul is from the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you have not been given from the knowledge except a little bit. So the soul is the battery to the body. It gives the body life. So when you find a cow walking, then you know that the cow has a body and a soul, because the soul is that subtle substance that makes the cow go. What makes us different as human beings is and the jinn is we have something third, which is called the nafs. And nafs, the self, is a nafs al-aqila, a nafs al-mudrika, a nafs al-natiqa. It is the nafs, the self, that intellects, that understands, that perceives, that can articulate. The nafs is you, it's your rational, capacity. And the nafs, as we know from the Quran, and this is what the subject of tasawwuf talks about, the nafs is of different kinds. It can be a nafs al-ammara bis-su', it can be the nafs that constantly calls to bad actions, it can be a nafs al-lawwama, the blameworthy self, it can be a nafs al-radiyya, a nafs al-mutma'inna, a nafs al-mulhama, a nafs al-kamila. There are different types of nafs. The subject of tasawwuf is how you go from one level of the nafs to the next. But for the purposes of usul al-din, for the purposes of our theology, we know that the tool that the nafs uses to understand these things is the intellect. And therefore, when we bring into our intellect, we are going to always have these three categories: necessary, possible, and impossible. So what are the things that are necessary about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, that Allah Ta'ala is one, that Allah Ta'ala is qadim, He's eternal, He is baqi, He has no end. Al-awwalu bidun bidaya wal-akhiru bidun nihaya. He is the beginning without end and the last without end. You know what the Christians call the Alpha and Omega. Okay, so I'm not going to give you all the categories because that's what the whole course is about. And then there are things that are possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is possible that Allah ta'ala forgives the person who does wrong. And it's also possible for Allah ta'ala to punish a believer for something that they did was wrong. It's jaiz. It's rationally possible that Allah ta'ala does things like that. And then there are all of these things that are impossible. It is impossible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not know particular things. You can't say, oh, Allah just knows that I exist, but He doesn't know what I'm thinking right now. No, He knows the universals, the kulliyat, and He knows the particulars, the juz'iyat. And this is one of the things that Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, in Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, he takes the philosophers to account, and he says that they commit disbelief on three issues, and this is one of the three issues, that Allah Ta'ala knows the universals and not the particulars. Because it goes against the text of the Quran. That everything is known by Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو ويعلم ما في البر والبحر وما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها ولا حبة في ظلمات الأرض ولا رطب ولا يابس إلا في كتاب مبين. And it's a very, very beautiful verse that Imam Muhammad Bakhit al-Muti'i, rahimahullah, he was a mufti of Egypt in the 1920s. When he used to sit down to do his commentary on the tafsir of Imam al-Razi, he would begin his class with that verse. And there's nothing small or big, not a leaf that falls, not a creature that stirs on land or on water, except that Allah Ta'ala knows about it. This is a nas of the Quran. It's a direct verse from the Quran that indicates that Allah Ta'ala knows the particulars as He knows the generals. Okay, so it would be impossible for us to say that Allah doesn't know the particulars. Now, when it comes to the three rational categories, just to give you another layer of detail, each category is going to be subdivided into two groups, either daruri or nadari, something that is self-evident or something that is potential. So in total, there'll be like 6 subcategories. I do not believe that we will really be using that a lot in my presentation on the commentary, but it is something that I want you to know about. So something that is rationally impossible, that is known necessarily, is that a physical atom can be moving and still at the same time. So it's necessarily impossible, rationally impossible. And something that is theoretically impossible, theoretically, rationally impossible, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having an associate, which is, it's impossible, rationally impossible, but it's not self-evident like the two opposites existing in one thing. It is nadari. It's something that requires just another step of intellection. And then lastly, in the last verse, he talks about, let me just turn to so we don't lose the text here. He talks about, since anyone who follows another in belief in oneness, his faith is not safe from doubt. So taqleed in the matters of aqeedah is the last thing that he ends by talking about. Can you follow another person's belief like we follow Imam al-Shafi'i in fiqh? Can I simply just follow Imam al-Laqani blindly? So he said no, because the problem is, well, the truth of the matter is that there's a difference of opinion. So, I gotta be honest, but the majority will say it's dangerous. That's what he's saying. It's dangerous because if you follow another person's belief, you are opening yourself to doubt, because you have to, what does it mean to follow? What is taqleed based on? In Islam, taqleed is based on following another's opinion without knowing their dalil, without knowing their proof. So what are going to be doing is we are reading the work of Imam al-Laqani, and we are following the Hashiyah more or less of Imam al-Bayjuri, rahimahullah. But we are also giving you the dalil, showing you the proof text behind these points of belief. So when you believe in something, and then you know why you believe in it, and you know a couple of dalils, points and counterpoints, then the iman is more firm in your heart. And that's a very important thing, because one of the meta principles of Islam, one of the first principles of Islam, is that our belief and our practice needs to be based on certainty. Don't you know, and don't you remember that when we pray, one of the conditions of prayer is you have to know that the time has come in, you have to know that you are facing the Qibla, you have to know that you have wudu, you have to know that the place you are praying is tahir. All of those obligate certainty in the act of worship. You can't just wing it. I think it's Salat al-Dhuhr and I'm going to pray. It doesn't count. You have to know that the time has come in with certainty. So the way that the Sharia is constructed is it promotes certainty for us. It promotes us to arrive at this level of certainty in our practice. Even more so is the case when it comes to Aqidah. So while we are following, the scheme of Ash'ari Sunni theology, and we will follow the scheme that the Ash'aris leave for us and how to understand the core traits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the necessary, possible and impossible rational things in regards to God and the Prophets, alayhi etc., etc. But what we will do is we will look at the proofs and we will investigate why. And even in today's 3 lectures, I've been quoting some of the hadith, some of the ayat of the Quran, giving you what the opponents say, what the Mu'tazila say, why they're wrong, and some of the mechanics of deconstructing their arguments. All of that is to help us arrive at a level of certainty that in our belief, so that our belief is not shaky. Because if your belief is shaky, God forbid, what can happen is it can lead you to disbelief. That's where the danger is. It's not about you have to be smart or you have to memorize all of these proofs. The issue is that you don't want your lack of certainty in your belief to lead you to disbelief, to lead you to hold a wrong view or a haram view or a bid'ah view of Allah Jalla wa Ala or Sayyidina Muhammad or any of the prophets for that matter. And unfortunately, throughout Islamic history, there were times in which people just hold wrong views and they're just not checked, and those wrong views end up becoming inherited by subsequent generations. So our job is to prevent that, inshallah, and to make sure that we find a sound path to our belief that will lead us to certainty. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's lecture, we talked about several, quite a few, mashallah, important topics. The first topic that we talked about is defining who is the morally responsible person, who is the mukallaf. And while we have taken a version of this before when we talked about Islamic law in our Furu'a class, in this class we emphasized the issue of receiving the da'wah of Islam. What does it mean to receive the message? Because upon defining that, you will be able to define who the disbeliever is. The disbeliever is not the automatic default of somebody who doesn't believe in Islam. The default of people is there are people. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Now there are believers and then there are non-believers. But the non-believers are not kuffar. The non-believers could be people that have not received the message of Islam or not understood the message of Islam or received partial or incorrect information about Islam. All of those people in Sunni Islam, we refer to them as Ahlul Fatra, the people of the time period, and they are saved by consensus amongst the ulama, even if they worship the idols or have no belief in God whatsoever, because they have not received the message for them to have rejected it. And Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. And then that then took us to talk about the parents of the Prophet ﷺ, and we showed that they were saved for one of 3 reasons, or 3 reasons concurrently. Either they're from Ahlul Fatra, or that they were pure monotheists, as is indicated in the verse وَتَقَلُّبُكَ فِي السَّاجِدِينَ. And then we have the traditions that the Prophet ﷺ asked Allah Ta'ala to cause his parents to be resurrected. They believed in him and then they were buried again. Then after that we started to introduce the view that we have of the intellect, and how in Sunni Islam we understand that good and bad as it relates to its punishment or reward in the hereafter is something that is established by revelation, as opposed to the Mu'tazilites. And then we added the Maturidi view in the middle, and then we began, the bulk of the rest of the class was to talk about the rational categories. Things are either rationally obligatory, rationally possible, rationally impossible. We talked about why that's important, and then we ended our class talking about taqleed, or following another person's views in Aqidah, the dangers of that, and how inshallah in our class, in this class and in the next one when we finish the book, we will inshallah do our best to give the adillah, the proof text, so we know why we believe in what we believe. So inshallah we have a level of certainty. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.